Hey, good morning, everybody. Man, I'm glad that you braved it out here to come. I feel a little bit cheated today, like a little robbed. Like, I did not know it was supposed to snow. That was a surprise to me. I was paying attention to the weather. And then I got up and it's snowing, and so I opened my weather app and it says it wasn't snowing. So I looked at when the snow was going to quit and it said it wasn't going to snow. And then I looked at the radar and it said it was snowing in Springfield, but not here. But sure enough, it was snowing all morning. So I don't know what to believe, but that's all right. We're here. We made it. And it's a great day to be here because we are getting ready to start a new series called By Faith. And I'll let you kind of know how we got to this series, kind of how my brain worked getting this process going. Because I'm hoping if I let you in on some of that process, then you'll be as excited about what we're getting ready to get into over the next few weeks as I have been thinking about it and preparing for it. So one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is the story of Noah. And I love that story. I love going back, and I've spent countless amounts of time in my life paralleling some of the actual historical secular references that are made and the historical biblical references that are made about the flood and where the flood was and did it occur. And I just think it's a very fascinating story. So I wanted to do a series on Noah. And as I kept kind of looking at and researching his story, I was doing all kinds of research. I even watched Evan Almighty, man. I wanted to make sure I had all the research possible. But I love that movie too, just because, again, it ties in with that. But anyway, I just kept having this one word come to me, and that was this word, faith. And I was thinking about these people in the Bible, these heroes of the Bible, these people in the Old Testament that we look and call heroes. And most of them are just regular dudes. Like, a lot of them aren't prophets or anything special. They're just regular people. But the thing that sets them apart from regular people and makes them heroes is their faith. The faith that they had. And that brings us to getting into this series called By Faith. And what I want to do in this series is I want to go back and I want to look at some of those heroes of the Old Testament. So week by week, we're going to kind of look into the different lives of like Noah and Moses and Abraham and Isaac and go through some of them. And if we can maybe take their faith and look at the faith that they have and then use that to help us level up our faith that we have. But what I want to do today as we start off this series is kind of set a background for it and say, okay, let's define what faith is. Let's understand what faith is before we can learn how we're going to grow our own faith. The thing I love about the Bible is a very honest book. I mean, it's honest about the brokenness of the world. It's honest about the brokenness inside of each one of us. And these people that we're going to look at their lives, they aren't perfect people. They're flawed. They mess up just like we do. But they continued and kept living by their faith. So I'm really excited, if you can't tell, about this series. And I hope I got you a little bit excited about us going into it too. And so what we're going to do, again, today is we're going to start off in Hebrews chapter 11 and look and deal with a couple of questions. First of all, what is faith? And second of all, what does faith do? What does it look like? We need to understand what faith is. What is faith? If you stop and just try to define faith, it's kind of difficult to do in just a few words. But we're going to go through this Hebrews chapter 11, And hopefully throughout today, we're going to come up with a pretty good definition of what faith is. Before we get to this Hebrews chapter 11, I want to go back a little bit and read the end of chapter 10 so we can have some kind of context for all this and understand the flow of what's happening going into chapter 11. So the book of Hebrews is written to a bunch of Jewish Christians, and the author is actually unknown of who exactly wrote Hebrews, but these Christians are living in the Roman Empire, probably around the actual city of Rome. And at this time, if you lived in the Roman Empire and you were Jewish, you had certain protections against you. But there was this new group, this new sect of Judaism that had kind of broke off that was called Christians, and they didn't have any protections against them from the Roman government. In fact, the persecution of Christians at this time was beginning to grow and grow, and so a lot of them started to think, man, maybe it might be a lot easier to not do this Christianity thing. Maybe it might be a lot easier to not follow Jesus, because I'm getting a lot of pressure from people in society and the government, and I'm even, all these bad things are happening to us because of what we believe. So maybe this Jesus thing isn't quite worth it after all. So this writer of Hebrews is writing to these Christians saying, man, don't fall back. Jesus is supreme. And it's what everything has been pointing to through time is this Jesus. So we'll go back and we'll read the very end of chapter 10, starting in verse 36. And it says this. It says, you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. And this next quote here is actually, he's quoting the prophet Habakkuk from the Old Testament. It says, in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith. And I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. But we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but those who have faith and are served. So these lines here in this, he says, you need to persevere. Life's hard. This is the truth, and you can't live without this truth, but we got to hold on to this truth of Jesus. And he says, in just a little while, he is coming. But quoting Habakkuk, and he said, who is he that he's talking about? It's a church answer. Who came from the Old Testament to the New Testament? It was Jesus, right? So like he's saying, Jesus is coming, he's on his way, and the righteous ones will live by faith. And that's the end of Hebrews 10. So we pick it up back there in Hebrews 11, verse 1. It says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance in what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. And the ancients it's referring to here are the ones that we're going to talk about within this series. He's talking about Noah. He's talking about Moses. He's talking about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all of them. And they were commended. And so by faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command so that what is seen is not made out of what was visible. It's amazing how much is packed into these three verses right here. So whatever this faith thing is that he's talking about, it must be pretty important. Because the heroes of the Old Testament were commended for having it. And we need to persevere in this life, and we need to preserve this faith that we have. And we're supposed to live by this faith. So what is it? What is faith? One more verse, Hebrews 11:6 says this. It says, and without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So we see in these verses that we need faith. We can't please God without faith. We can't persevere without faith. We can't live without faith. So what is faith? Before we talk about what faith is, I want to talk about what faith is not. Because I think faith is a word that has been used so commonly lately that it's kind of lost the meaning and context of what it really is. If we're looking at what biblical faith is, because we talk about faith all the time, have faith in your fellow man, have faith that your team will win, have faith, just believe, take a leap of faith, So what is faith? I want to talk about real quick what faith is not. Faith is not blind optimism. It's not blind faith. It's not believing in something despite of the evidence. It's not manufactured hope. We're not making it up. It's not coming from within you. It's not something that you decide is going to be true, and so you're going to believe it into existence. And it's not irrational thinking. In other words, it's not believing in something that you know is not true. It's not like flat earthers having faith that the earth is flat. I mean, we know it's not true. It's been proven that it's not true. You can tell me it's true, and you can tell me you believe it's not true, but that's irrational to say with the science and technology that we have. Well, when you read the actual definition of faith, it says it's the assurance of things hoped for and the confidence of things not seen. So that definition that we have of faith, and this is not a biblical definition of faith, but that definition of faith as a word, it reads like this is something I made up. This is something that isn't really there. But I believe it to be this way anyway. But that's not what biblical faith is. So what is faith? It's a relational trust and confidence in a God you have good reason to believe. Let's go back at Hebrews 11 and let's look at verse 1 again. And I want to look at two different translations. I'll often use NIV translation, but I use a lot of translations, and sometimes, and I'll even do it later today, sometimes I just want to look at different contexts or different ways that a certain person looked at the original text, whether it's Aramaic or Greek or whatever it be. It was Greek in this case, and see how they put those words to English. So we're going to read the NIV, which we read already, and then we're going to go back and look at the New King James Version. The NIV said, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." The New King James Version says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen." So these words confidence and substance kind of seem like different words and kind of almost give it a different meaning. Substance is something that we know is there and is tangible. Confidence is just something that we kind of believe in. But when they were translating this word in there, the original word is hypostasis, and it actually means substance, assurance, confidence, essence, and reality. And what this word was used for in other contexts, in Greek literature outside of the Bible, this word actually meant, it was used in relation to property ownership documents. So what it would mean is this is evidence of ownership. This is evidence that this belongs to somebody. And the writer of Hebrews is using this word and saying faith is an assurance. Faith isn't just something that you make up, but there's proof, there's evidence in this. There's confidence and substance in this idea of faith. Faith isn't a mental state that you have to get yourself into. It's not something that you make up. It's actually based on something. Let me put it this way. Faith is a transfer of trust which requires obedience. It's that relationship between you and God, and that trust that makes you obedient. Faith is living as if God is telling us the truth. Because God is telling us the truth, and that truth that we believe is going to put us into action. So that's what faith is. So let's look at what faith does. Y'all have seen somebody do a trust fall before, right? Like, I was going to bring Pastor Perry up here and do the example, but I don't trust me, and I don't think he would. He trusts me, but these old arms are getting weak, and that'd get ugly for maybe both of us. But you know what that is. Somebody gets and they fall back, and you got to let them grab you, and you trust that they're going to do that. You can say that you have faith all you want. You can show up to church. You can read your Bible. But where is that testing point? If you're doing a trust fall with somebody, you have faith that person is going to catch you. You better have a lot of faith because it could be bad. But where is that testing point of faith? Where's the proving ground for your faith? And where that is it's in your life. It's in your obedience. When you look at the people that we're going to look at throughout the series, Noah, Abraham, Moses, the faith was in their life. And it always cost them something. There was always a risk involved at some point in their life because of their faith, putting themselves out there. And faith will often have a level of cost for you too, whether it's your reputation or whether it's something culturally. But what I see a lot more common today is people have this faith, but it's not a true faith. It's more like an intellectual agreement. It's like, God, yeah, I agree, mostly. I agree with what you say, except for this part over here. I don't really like that. If I have to sacrifice, I don't so much agree with all of this. It doesn't actually transfer into our life. So looking at what faith does, I want to go back and read in Romans chapter 5, verse 1. And it says, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all nations. Now, sometimes I read a verse and I'm just like, I don't really get what it's saying right there. I don't really have any idea what I'm supposed to catch out of there. That's what I was saying earlier, and I kind of like to go to other translations and look around. So I went to the Message and I read this too. And the Message isn't a literal translation, but the Message is like a translation of a translation. It's modernizing the Bible a little bit, but they didn't actually take the original text and put it over. And the Message says it this way. It says, through him we receive both generous gifts of his life and urgent task of passing it on to others who receive it by entering into obedient trust in Jesus. So through Jesus, we receive grace, and we also receive the obedience of faith. We receive the obedience in following God's will for our life. And then Paul says a little later in in chapter 16, verse 26, he says, but now been disclosed and through the prophetic writings has been made known to all nations according to the command of the eternal God to bring about the obedience and faith. And what we're writing here in Romans is exactly what we're talking about in Hebrews. When we're talking about all these people lived by faith, all these people in the Old Testament, these heroes of the Bible lived by faith. They had faith of assurance of things that they hoped for and confidence of things that they hadn't seen. Faith is hard to have. It's hard to live out. I know that I myself like to live by like a cost-benefit analysis idea. Okay, if I do this action, what's going to happen before I decide if I'm going to do it? I need to know the return. I need to know what I'm going to get. And then I may go forward depending on how I know the outcome is going to be, but that's not faith. C.S. Lewis writes in his book, Mere Christianity, which I've used quite a bit over the years on stage here. He has this quote in there. It says, to have faith in Christ means, of course, trying to do all that he says. There would be no sense in saying you trusted a person if you didn't take their advice. Thus, if you have really handed yourself over to him, it must follow that you're trying to obey him. So that doesn't mean that you're perfect. It doesn't mean that you're not going to screw up. It just means that the faith in your life is producing something. And what does faith produce? Faith produces obedience. Faith produces obedient people that begin to live and walk and talk and do in their life what God is guiding them to do. Faith makes it possible for us to experience now what we hope for in the future. Faith, and not just belief, because we can have believe that we should or are supposed to do something, but faith, which is obedience and actions to our belief, faith is what makes it possible for us to experience right now what we hope for in the future. And what is it that we hope for in the future? Well, I know for me, it's the day when there is no more crying and no more tears and no more death and no more pain and constant worship. And that moment that we get to spend eternity in heaven with Jesus, that dwelling with him forever. And all these future hopes that I have are based off this Word of God, and my faith in God is that I believe that his words are true. And we have the opportunity to experience those little tastes of his presence by our own faith, by our own obedience, and by our own following. What does it mean to truly trust Jesus with everything? To put your full weight of everything on him. I mean everything. With our finances and our kids' futures and our marriage and our friendships and every bit of it on him, our past, our present. Put all of it on him. Because if most of us are really honest, we might put some of it on him. We might give away the parts that aren't as valuable to us. But I got to control certain things, God. But to put everything on him, that's what living out by faith looks like. And as we do that, it says that Jesus gives us the ability to obey. Gives us grace, and he gives us obedience. And then he's faithful to our needs. And as he's faithful to our needs, we want to obey more. And there's this kind of circular cycle that's going on that's building faith. Growing in faith doesn't mean knowing more things. It doesn't mean being a Bible scholar or knowing what some Greek word means or whatever. But it means trusting him more and obeying him more. Faith isn't just an additive of your life, you know. You need a little faith or you need to have more faith. It truly is your whole life. If you have that faith in him, it consumes every part of your life. So that's what faith is. And that's what faith does. Last thing I want to talk about today is what faith reveals. If we notice in verse 1, the language that it's using is kind of about what we hope for, what we don't see. It says, you know, faith is confidence in what we hope for. It's kind of future-oriented. But faith just isn't future-oriented. It's also located in the present. It helps us see things. I'm not talking about like some magic glasses that we can see other things that other people in the world can. It's not a secret knowledge. But being able to see what's real in this world that has a very cloudy culture. Being able to see through our obedience a clear vision of what God's path for our life is. We can see what faith reveals in verse 3. We read it before, and we'll read it again real quick. It says, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that when it was seen, it was not made out of what was visible. I think this is brilliant. I mean, like just reading this and thinking about it, when we look at God's massive power that he has. He created the universe out of nothing. Like there wasn't stuff over here, and then he built it and made different stuff over here. Like we're used to that. Like I'm blown away by excellent craftsmen that can take raw materials and turn them into something. But God made it out of nothing. There was nothing there to begin with, and it all exists through the power of his words. In Colossians 1:16 it says, for by him all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in all things hold together. Science can't truly tell us why all these things exist. There's lots of theories. There's lots of very, very, very smart people that have spent their life trying to figure out how this world came about. Trying to figure out how the very beginning happened. And they've tried for years and years, but haven't been able to come to a conclusion through science. And science would tell you the existence of a God is an irrational thought. That the idea of faith in itself is irrational. But the answer to this is right there in God's Word. In verse 3, the writer of Hebrews is telling these people, they're telling these Christians back there that are in this Roman Empire, he's saying, man, don't be tempted to fall back. Don't be tempted to go back where you were. Don't be tempted to not follow Jesus, because you already know that the world that God made, he made out of nothing. And you know that to be true. And you and I are living evidence that this world was created by God, and God has the ability and the power to do all of this. And if God made the world out of nothing, then we should live by faith that one day he will remake it and he will remake us. And that's what we have to look forward to. And I think that's pretty exciting stuff when you think about it. So I want to kind of wrap up here. I'll end that thought. I want to read a little bit later in Hebrews 11, verse 13. It said, all these people were still living in faith when they died. I'll get back to that in a minute, who all these people were. But anyway, they did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners of strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had an opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So what's being done here? These Hebrew Christians are thinking about going back to their old life, thinking about going back and converting to this Judaism again. But this writer here is reminding them, because both they and we are in this in-between time right now. And they being the people in the Old Testament. That's who he was writing about in the beginning. Those people that we're going to talk about throughout this series. Because they were waiting on somebody too, right? They were waiting on Jesus. And we're waiting on somebody too, right? We're waiting on Jesus. Jesus is going to come back. And this writer is saying, man, don't stop and look back. And you may not get to this point where you ever get to see the Messiah within this earth, within this life. But look at the faith those people had. Look at the faith that Abraham had. Look at the faith that Jacob had. Moses had. Because you'll get to see it. Because God has a place already prepared for you in heaven. And living with this mindset of faith and obedience. And it makes this future hope real. His presence, his power, his ability is real right now. What our culture really needs is a few more Christians living really strong by faith and not living by judgment, not living by criticism, not living by anger, and not hiding behind Facebook posts and talking about how you're a bad person, but truly living by faith. Faith is the assurance of what we hope for and the deep convictions of the things that we don't see yet, which leads us to our obedience now. Father, I come to you this morning very, very merciful at your grace that you have. Lord, I am so thankful of your love for us, for the opportunity that we have to serve a gracious, loving God. And Lord, I pray that as we continually are trying to build that relationship with you, Lord, that we look at where we're standing in our faith with you. Are we leaning on you fully? Are we trusting you with the areas that you've asked us to trust you with? Lord, I pray that as you reveal those to us, that we could begin to turn those over to you and stop worrying about them and continue to just build that faith within you. That we could utilize these stories that we're going to look at over the next few weeks to speak to us in a manner to show us, man, where am I lacking? Where do I need to really bite into to have that deeper relationship with you? Pray all this in your name. Amen.